Hello everyone, my name is Carlos Elmadjian. I am a PhD candidate in computer science at the University of São Paulo, Brazil, and I'm also one of the authors of this work titled Eye Movement Classification with Temporal Convolutional Networks. So in this work we try to achieve two different goals. First, to improve the current state of the art of the so-called tertiary eye movement classification problem, and second, to increase our own understanding of how end-to-end architectures behave on this problem. And we do this through a set of exploratory experiments. Now, this tertiary eye movement classification problem usually involves the simultaneous detection of three different eye movement patterns: fixations, saccades, and smooth pursuits. This has become a classical problem in the eye tracking community, and it is still relevant and challenging today. Many commercial applications and research areas such as psychology and human-computer interaction depend on it. And it is challenging because although it's generally easy to distinguish saccades from fixations or fixations from smooth pursuits, when these three patterns are considered at the same time, it gets hard to isolate each one of them depending on the temporal window frame that is being considered. So for instance, in this context, it is not clear that we are observing the end of a saccade or not, while in this context that becomes clear. Now, if we take a look at how this problem has been handled so far, we see that the first solutions often relied on manual thresholds to segment fixations from saccades or saccades from smooth pursuits, but they were not really as accurate as more modern methods, and they suffered a lot with noise. We also identified a second class of algorithms, which we have called probabilistic methods, since they resort to some degree of statistical inference to discriminate eye movement patterns. Though they are fast and more accurate than threshold-based methods, they still require manual intervention and they are usually user-dependent. And finally, we started to see more recently the use of end-to-end architectures to solve this problem. And of course, I'm mainly talking about deep learning approaches here. But what is so exciting about end-to-end architectures? Well, it's not a secret that deep neural models nowadays have achieved the human-level classification performance in many problems. So in theory, we could get a very accurate classifier. Another advantage is that it requires no manual parameter setting. So once the network is trained, there is no need for continuous adjustments. And finally, it does not have to be trained or adapted to specific users to work well. But there are still some downsides to consider. First, the high computational cost, which is getting more negligible with time, but it's still there. Also, to perform well, these networks usually need large, representative, and manually labeled datasets for training. And of course, training time is still a significant con for these models, so retraining is relatively expensive. Until recently, the state of the art in terms of end-to-end architectures for problems such as this generally involved the use of some family of sequential networks such as LSTMs or GRUs. That is the case, for example, of the model proposed by Start7 and others, which is a 1D CNN bidirectional LSTM. Specialized sequential architectures are particularly effective in this case because they have a recurrent structure that allows them to learn relatively long dependencies between sequential data without necessarily being impacted by the so-called vanishing gradient problem. So why are temporal convolutional networks a good idea? Well, today we know that attention-based approaches can work just as good or even better than LSTMs on sequential problems. Likewise, TCNs have been demonstrated to achieve comparable or even superior performance than LSTMs or GRUs in some applications. Additionally, because TCNs are basically convolutional nets, they have a highly parallel structure, which makes them faster for training or making predictions. They also require on average less memory to work because they don't have to store partial results for cell gates as sequential models do. But most interestingly, dilated convolutions allow them to grow the receptive field exponentially, which is great for long-term dependencies. TCNs also follow some basic principles. First, they rely on causal convolutions, meaning that there is no information leakage from future states to the past. Second, convolutions are dilated, which means that they care more about integrating knowledge of the widest context possible at a low cost. Third, they use a residual block between input and output, which is a great way of preserving backpropagation stability. And last, they can take sequences of arbitrary length and map them to an output sequence of the same length. But our proposed TCN model has some peculiarities. First, we use non-causal dilated convolutions. Although this violates the principle of letting information from future states leak to the past, this allows us to have a competitive stance against bidirectional LSTMs, since they can traverse sequential data in two directions. Also, instead of using the standard rectify linear unit activation function between layers, we used the hyperbolic tangent. But this was more an empirical-based decision rather than a theoretical one. Other configurations about, for example, dropout rates or kernel size and so on were also determined empirically and are available in our paper and in our public repository as well. As we mentioned before, we also wanted to improve our own understanding of how end-to-end architectures behave in the eye movement classification problem. And we did this by exploring the effect of feature space, feature scale, and temporal window size on model performance. In the feature space investigation, we added several combinations of novel features, such as standard deviation between samples and gaze displacement, besides the already tested speed and direction. It is also important to observe that these features are extracted in a multi-scale fashion before feeding the network. In our study, we added 3 new temporal scales. Finally, because features are regarded only within a window context, we also considered 2 additional window sizes, one that accounted for roughly 1.5 seconds and another for 2 seconds. In this work, we used only the GazeCon dataset for a couple of reasons. First, it is a large dataset manually labeled by experts, with 18 clips of approximately 47 users watching natural video footage. It seems very well suited for end-to-end architectures because it has a great variability. And it's also challenging because it's far from being balanced, either on sample or event level, as we can see in the graphs. And of course, this dataset was a natural choice in order to compare our TCN model with the ones from Start7 and others. All aspects of training, such as context window selection and feature extraction, were rigorously the same ones of Start7 and others, which involved the use of a leave one video out cross-validation method, except for the absence of padding in the context windows, the use of the Adam optimizer with different learning rate, and since the network converged fast, we limited the number of epochs to 20 and the number of mini-batches to 128. And finally, we used the TensorFlow 2. We used the same metrics and evaluation tools provided before. This means that our results were generated by the SP2, so they are reported in terms of individual F1 scores for saccades, fixations, and smooth pursuits, both in sample and event level. Although the definition of an eye movement event varies considerably in the literature, we settled with the one by Hug and others. We did not retrain the models from Start7 and others, though we reran them using the SP2, obtaining the same results as reported before. The exploratory study on feature space, feature scale, and window size was done using only the TCN model. When running the evaluation tools against the first TCN models, we observed that the event level F1 scores were considerably low. When we investigated the matter, we realized that the TCN model was predicting some sparse, spurious labels that didn't belong to the event. This barely had an effect on sample level F1 scores, but it affected the event classification significantly. We designed then a simple filter based on domain knowledge that changed isolated samples of fixations, saccades, or smooth pursuits to the next closest neighbor. That said, when we look at the results, we observe that both our conventional TCN model or the TCN enhanced by feature manipulation were able to surpass or match the scores previously reported by Start7 and others on sample level for all patterns. But the most noticeable gain was in terms of smooth pursuit detection. With the domain knowledge-based filter, TCNs were also able to achieve the highest event-level scores in the GazeCon dataset for fixation, saccades, and smooth pursuits, and, once more, the largest difference was observed with pursuits. As for the exploratory study, we observed that the feature space manipulation barely contributed for any improvement. The most significant gains were observed with the increment in feature scale size and particularly with context window size. Those gains were also most evident with smooth pursuits, which could be explained in part by the fact that pursuits are typically long events. It is also interesting to observe that the highest scores were not registered with the largest feature scale or the largest window configuration. So, to sum things up, in this work we proposed the use of TCNs for eye movement classification, and we showed that they can achieve and surpass the state of the art in this particular problem, either on sample or event level classification. Our investigation also showed that the most determining factors to increase performance lies with feature scale and context window size, but the model choice itself still is more important. We also highlighted some architectural advantages of TCNs over previous sequential models, and this could be further explored with more ambitious parameters for training. Finally, because TCNs are more parallel and lightweight, as a future work, we are interested in experiment with them for real-time online classification. Well, that was it. Thank you all for listening, and please refer to our paper or our public repository shown here for further details. Now we'll open for questions.